Good morning, San Bernardino, Riverside, the Inland Empire, Rancho Cucamonga. I love saying Rancho Cucamonga, and Loma Linda, California. And good afternoon and good evening to those listening to us on the live stream link. This is the Kathleen Wells Show, and I'm Kathleen. And today, our first guest is former Congressman Alan Grayson, who has earned the reputation as a progressive Democrat. He represented Florida's 8th district, which was historically a Republican district. He represented that district for 2 years, and he's running again for Congress in 2012, and I'm going to ask him exactly why is he doing that. And after the break, we will discuss home foreclosures with Jack Conte, who is a mortgage document analyst, and he's going to share with us a new federal program that deals with home foreclosure. So let's get to my first guest. Representative Alan Grayson made a name for himself during his first 2 years in Congress with a fiery floor speech attacking the Republican health care plan. Grayson summed up the Republican health care plan as, don't get sick, and if you do get sick, die quickly. Well, Congressman Grayson, thank you for joining me this day.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Congressman Grayson, why have you decided to run back, to take your seat back, to run again in 2012?
Because of all the good that we were able to accomplish in just 2 short years. I was the first Democrat to represent downtown Orlando in 34 years, and even in the course of 2 years, we were able to get an awful lot done for people here locally. Just to give you a few examples, among other things, we started a mandatory mediation program that cut foreclosures in Orange County in half. They went from $3,000 a month down to $1,500 a month. We also, through support for health care and the Affordable Health Care Act, passed a bill that will give health insurance to the 20% of the people in my district, 100,000 people in my district, who don't have any health coverage at all, including 40% of our Latinos. That's going to make a huge difference. It's going to save lives and save money. We also, among other things, doubled the amount of competitive grant money coming into the district from $100 million to $200 million by starting a grants program that actually assisted local people in applying for federal grants. And nationally, one of the greatest impacts that we had was joining with Congressman Ron Paul to get the first independent audit of the Federal Reserve done in the 96-year history of the Federal Reserve, which has now uncovered $26 trillion in secret bailouts.
You know, someone emailed me. I'm not familiar with the hearing on the Federal Reserve. Can you give us a little bit more specifics on that?
Sure. Well, I was very discouraged when I was elected to see the Federal Reserve for the first time in its 1 century of history was starting to play favorites. Up to that point, the Federal Reserve lent out through the discount window to all comers. It also bought and sold federal bonds, treasury bills, in order to increase or decrease the money supply in a neutral fashion. Then when the economic crisis hit in 2008, the Federal Reserve started to pick winners and losers by extending loans on very soft terms, 0.01%, to its favorites, certain institutions that it wanted to help as opposed to other institutions that it decided to let fail. The Federal Reserve is populated by people who are from Wall Street. The federal regional banks are actually run by local institutions. Like, for instance, the New York Federal Reserve is actually supervised by people like Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan. And the indications were that they were using the Federal Reserve's loan-making abilities, its emergency loan-making abilities, to give themselves bailout money. That was what I suspected. There was some evidence of it at the time, but it was very secret. And now what happened was I joined with Congressman Ron Paul to pass the Paul Grayson Amendment, which instituted the first independent audit of the GAO in its 96-year history. Ron Paul introduced that legislation 26 years ago when I was still in school and never got it even as far as a hearing. But thanks to my oversight work, my work with regard to, for instance, examining under oath people like Elizabeth Coleman, the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve, which became the most watched video in congressional history. Over 5 million people have now downloaded and watched that video. As a result of that, we created a groundswell of support for something that had been stuck and unable to pass for a quarter of a century. And we were able to get that bill through with bipartisan support. In fact, it became the only bill I can think of that actually passed Congress, the 111th Congress, with bipartisan support. As a result of that, the GAO conducted its audit, and it found that, among other things, what the so-called broad-based programs of the Fed had handed out $16 trillion to the institutions that the Fed selected. And in addition to that, the Fed handed out another $10 trillion to foreign central banks, who then conducted bailouts of foreign entities like UBS, the bank in Switzerland. So altogether, we're talking about, just from those two programs, $26 trillion with a T, $26 trillion in bailouts that we wouldn't have known about except for this legislation. And that totals almost $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
So you've been out of Congress now, and how do we know? How can Americans know that the work that you've done in those 2 years won't be undone?
Well, the audit is now relatively complete, and we actually have the GAO's report. The GAO actually itemized the top recipients for these bailouts. So, for instance, we know that 4 American banks were chosen by the Fed to receive over $1 trillion in bailout money, and we know that 4 of the top 10 recipients of the Fed's secret bailouts were foreign banks. That can't be undone right now. Also, we're already starting to see the benefit of the Affordable Health Care Act. For instance, now people can keep their children on their own health coverage, their own health care plan up to the age of 27. That's already happened. Another thing that's already happened is that senior citizens now have seen the closing of the donut hole. And in addition to that, they no longer have to pay for their preventative routine care with co-payments as they did before. So senior citizens have already seen substantial benefits from the Affordable Health Care Act. And starting next year, and it's true this can be taken away by the Republicans, which is why we have to fight for what's right next year. Mm-hmm. Starting next year and the year afterward, we will start to see federal subsidies that will help to make make health care insurance affordable. But right now, if you have not had health care coverage for 6 months, you can apply for and get federal health care coverage, which in Florida, up to the age of 64 years old, costs only $471 a month. Mm-hmm. And that's no pre-existing conditions, no lifetime caps or any other kinds of caps. That's essentially equal to full Medicare coverage for $471 a month.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so President Obama yesterday gave a speech in Kansas, and that speech was basically focused on the economy. Specifically, he addressed the need to extend the payroll tax cut that is set to expire at the end of the month. In fact, Obama said if we don't do that, if we don't extend the tax cuts, 160 million Americans will see their taxes go up by an average of $1,000 starting in January, and this will essentially weaken the economy. Yet we see that the Republicans are against this. The Republicans, who are usually in favor of tax cuts, this particular cut they're against. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the Republicans pretend that they never met a tax cut they didn't like, but in fact, in practice, they're against all the tax cuts for the middle class, and they end up favoring only the tax breaks for the rich and the giant multinational corporations. Their deeds are what matters here, not their words. And their deeds are they have consistently opposed anything resembling a tax cut for ordinary Americans. But that's exactly the kind of tax cut that we need. Because what happens is if you stuff more and more money into the pockets of the very rich and the multinational corporations, they just hold it. They just hold on to it. In fact, that's why they're called rich, okay? The rich are rich because they don't spend as much money as they get. And that's what makes them rich. That's why they're rich. So you're never going to be able to revive the economy by putting more and more money into the hands of people who don't spend it. President Obama's payroll tax cut does exactly the right thing in that regard. What it does is, first of all, it puts money in the hands of people who need it, which is always a good thing. Secondly, it puts money in the hands of people who will spend it. And in doing so, when they spend their money, they'll do so, let's say, by going and getting a haircut. Mm-hmm. And then the barber will go and take that money and go in the restaurant and spend the money in the restaurant. Then the waitress will take that money and go and spend it on her rent or her mortgage. So the money will go round and round and round, unlike when you give yet another undeserved tax break to the oil and gas companies or to the billionaires. They simply don't spend it, and that money is then lost to the economy forever.
Now, you have a degree in economics, and you have worked with Ron Paul, who is a libertarian, essentially, although he's officially a Republican, but he believes in the libertarian ideology. And I talked about that ideology. It's about free market. And, in fact, in Obama's speech yesterday, he talked about free markets. And Roosevelt talked about free markets. Obama actually quoted Roosevelt in saying there must be restraints on free markets. Yet libertarians don't believe in any restraints, any regulations on free markets. What do you think? How do you think libertarians are wrongheaded in their ideology, or do you think they're wrongheaded?
We have now. I've had long discussions about this sort of thing with Dr. Paul and other people. I will give you one example that I think is pretty obvious to people. We have what is called a fractional reserve banking system, meaning that the banks can lend out more money than they actually have in deposits. That's the way it's been since the 17th century in Italy. It's been that way for hundreds of years. That is, in essence, the ability to create money, and that has to be heavily regulated because everywhere where it has not been regulated, including in Italy in the 17th century, what happens is some banks get a little bit carried away. There are banks that have a 20% reserve requirement. They're replaced by banks with a 10% reserve requirement, then banks with a 3% reserve requirement, then banks with a 1% reserve requirement. Sooner or later, the system becomes unstable, and you have a crash. It's only if you have government regulation that you can possibly avoid that. I'll give you another example. In a libertarian world, there'd be no restrictions on pollution. There'd be no restrictions on all sorts of things that we take for granted today, like car safety, food safety, the things that basically keep us healthy. All of those things would go out the window in a libertarian life. And I'll tell you, I've been to Somalia. In Somalia, you see what a libertarian paradise would look like because there's no public services, there's essentially no government, and everybody has guns. It's not pretty.
It's not pretty.
It's really not pretty.
Well, I discussed it once, and I had a caller call in, and he said, well, we had libertarianism in the 1800s in Sweden, partially, he said. I did some research. I didn't see anything. I think because the thesis or the position I was taking is that you do not have an example of libertarianism in industrialized countries, Western civilization.
Well, what happens under such a regime is very quickly you end up with extraordinary extremes. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer in a matter of just a few years. And the result of that is that the middle class is wiped out. And everybody becomes a debt slave or a wage slave. The very freedom that libertarians claim to be promoting is lost, and it's lost very quickly. We've known for 100 years now, at least, that we need a progressive taxation system in a modern economy to prevent the very rich from getting very richer and the very poor from getting very poorer. We're not going to go back to the situation anytime soon where 80% of the population are farmers, and they're all, farming and selling what they can, and basically living off the land. That's not the modern economy. The modern economy has, frankly, a much greater degree of interdependence and an opportunity for runaway monopolies and other extravagance on the part of vested interest in the wealthy.
Well, and aren't we kind of like headed that way anyway? It's like the top 400 people have more money than the bottom 150 million combined. So aren't we sort of headed in that direction anyway without libertarianism?
Yes, and you can see the results. I mean, the reason why we have 24 million people in this country who can't find full-time work is because of the egregious inequalities. The reason why we have 50 million people in this country who can't see a doctor when they're sick is because of the inequality, the unequal distribution of income and wealth. The reason why we have 47 million people in this country who need government assistance to feed themselves in the food stamp program is because of the inequality, the extreme inequality that we have here of income and wealth. In fact, according to Wikipedia, the United States has the fifth most unequal distribution of wealth in the entire world. And frankly, it's not working out well in Zimbabwe either. Now, I want America to be number one, but America is close to number one right now in inequality, and that's not going to be good in the long run or even the short run for the American middle class.
And Newt Gingrich is wanting our poor children to work as janitors. In fact, you worked as a janitor when you were going to college, so you have a familiarity with that job classification.
Right. I cleaned toilets when I was in college, working my way through college. I also was a night watchman on the midnight shift.
So you think our poor kids should work as assistant janitors? I know the answer. That's sort of a rhetorical.
I'm not even sure. Honestly, I'm not even sure they're going to be able to find jobs like that. If Newt Gingrich has his way, I think the only jobs that they'll be able to find in the 21st century economy that he's trying to create is maybe builders of yachts and butlers. That's about it.
That's about it. Well, let me ask you, I know your time is limited. I want to ask you about Occupy Wall Street. There is no trust anymore between Main Street and Wall Street, and I don't think the Occupy folks, the Occupy movements, are necessarily looking to D.C. and the politicians to come up with remedies to solve problems. What do you say to these Occupy movements?
Well, first, I think that in general, their complaints are entirely warranted. It is, in fact, true that this is a country with enormous, staggering inequality, that there is a 99% and there is a 1%. Secondly, we suffer greatly for it. It's not just a question of what's the best ideal system in the abstract. The cost that we pay for having such an unequal system, as the Occupy Wall Street movement has pointed out, is a human cost. It's cost in people losing their homes, cost of people losing their jobs, cost of people getting sick and dying because they have no health coverage, when we're the only industrialized country in the entire world that lacks it, that lacks universal health coverage. These are the actual costs that you pay. And in fact, it's Wall Street that creates that system, and Wall Street that perpetuates that system by its control over the political process. Wall Street determines our economic policy, the military-industrial complex determines our foreign policy, and big oil determines our energy policy and our environmental policy. And those are the underlying core truths that the Occupy Wall Street movement is recognizing and trying to do something about, as opposed to, let's say, the Tea Party, which basically frets over black helicopters and very little else.
But they're not going to Occupy Wall Street. They feel the politicians don't have the answers. How can you? And even, let's say you win your seat again in 2012. You're one man.
Oh, but I feel like we did so much. I mean, even in 2 years, I can look back on what we did. I don't want to bore your audience, okay? But I think that we accomplished a tremendous amount, and part of the reason for that is that I was separated from the system of lobbyist handouts that most political figures are dependent upon. In my case, people came to our website, congressmanwithguts.com, during the last campaign, and over 100,000 people, almost 100,000 people, made contributions at our website, congressmanwithguts.com. And as a result of that, I raised more money for our campaign last time than any other Democratic member of Congress, even though I was a first-term Democrat representing a district that had been Republican for 34 years. I mean, well, our campaign was an exercise in people power, and as a result of that, I was liberated from having to cater to the lobbyists the way all the Republicans and so many of the Democrats do.
So how does it look? How's it looking for 2012? Are you optimistic of you winning your seat back?
I am. Already we have the support of over 20,000 people who've come to the website, congressmanwithguts.com, and made a contribution. People have signed up for our emails, over 400,000 of them now. And those people are people whom we regularly communicate with. We're basically the beginnings of a progressive community that's nationwide. And I find it very encouraging. Now, a lot depends upon the redistricting process. We're going to have to see something resembling a fair district. I mean, in my case, I started with a district that had been Republican for 34 years, and I ran for re-election in a year that was the worst year for Democrats since 1896. So, talk about bad breaks. And I think that in any reasonable year, in any reasonable district, I would have been able to win re-election because we really did do a lot for people locally in Orlando and throughout the country that made a difference. That's why in 24 short months, I was able to attract the financial support of 100,000 people. In addition to that, we had an enormous number of volunteers working on the campaign. In one single day in October of 2010, we had 68,000 live phone calls from volunteers into the district. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of activism that we were able to inspire because people like a congressman with guts. They want to see a Democrat who's not ashamed to be a Democrat, but willing to stand up for what's right and to fight for what's right, whether it's health care, whether it's jobs, whether it's foreign policy or anything else. They want a Democrat with guts. And that's why we were so successful in putting together a campaign that could win a district that had been Republican for 34 years.
Well, why did you think you lost?
Oh, because Democrats just didn't vote last year. And it wasn't just in my district. If you look all around the state in Florida and you look all around the country, except in the West Coast and except in New England, the Democratic turnout was down by almost 60% between 2008 and 2010. The Republican turnout was barely down; it was down by about 20%. Mm-hmm. So if you look at all the congressional districts together in Florida, in the average congressional district in Florida, in 2008 the Democrats won by 6 points. In 2010 they lost by 18. And I could have won every Democratic vote and every independent vote in my district and still would have lost last year because the Republican turnout was absolutely astronomical and the Democratic turnout was non-existent. If Democrats don't vote, then Democrats can't win. But I think that, first of all, our district lines are going to be different next year. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I think that Democrats now feel they have to vote for their own safety because they see that the Republicans are going to take away their Social Security, take away their Medicare, take away their Medicaid, take away their unemployment insurance, take away their student loans. So they have to vote to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so we can anticipate that Donald Trump will be holding a what is it called? A panel. What do you call it?
Debate?
Exactly, on the 27th. So Newt Gingrich has decided that he's going to attend this debate. I think this is taking the whole political scenario to a new level. It's definitely.
Well, I mean, look, it's perfectly clear from the quintillion debates they've already conducted that the Republicans have no answers to anybody's problems. I mean, I, to some degree, became famous for mocking the Republicans for not having a health care plan. I said their health care plan was don't get sick. And if you do get sick, then die quickly.
But that's true
right across the board.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. That was played constantly over and over in a loop in the media.
Because it represented a core truth that the Republicans had no answers to people's problems. And I asked them, I listened to all the speeches, I asked them over and over again, what would you do about the 40, now 50 million Americans who don't have health insurance? What would you do for them? What would you do about the 40,000 Americans who die every year because they have no health care, because they have no health insurance? And that's a fact. That's just, the Harvard study demonstrated that if you take two people who are absolutely identical in terms of age, gender, weight, smoking history, two people who are physically identical, the one without health insurance is 20% more likely to die every year than the one with health insurance. So we're losing a lot of people who we could be saving if we simply allowed people who are sick to go to a doctor and get the care that they needed. And I asked them over and over again, what's your answer for those people? And they'd mumble something about tort reform, some meaningless nonsense about tort reform. Well, we've had their so-called tort reform in Florida for 12 years now, and the result of that is that we have the third highest rate of uninsured in the entire country. So the American people want and deserve answers. They want and deserve solutions to their problems. And the Republicans have nothing to offer. And I used to get in trouble for saying things like that because I'd say to the Republicans, you got nothing. And they'd say back to me, well, that's a sort of a nasty thing to say. I'd say to them, no, I mean, it's the truth. You got nothing. If you want me to say that, then go get something. But they never did. Listen to Herman Cain's jobs program. What is his jobs program anyway? An extra topping on your pizza? Honestly, I think that their program for the recovery is prayer and nothing else. I have not heard of a single proposal by the Republicans that would create a single job. And I've been listening very closely, not only when I was in Congress, but since then. And that the American people deserve better than that.
Yes,
and frankly, they deserve better than a payroll tax extension. They deserve to hear exactly what can be done to put 24 million Americans back to work.
No doubt about it. You and I are on the same page with that. I want to thank you, Congressman Grayson. I know your time is limited, so I'm going to wrap up now. And do you remember our interview on HuffPost? I looked at your Wikipedia bio and I saw you had it listed there. I'm actually flattered, but I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's my pleasure, and I want to thank your audience for having a conscience.
Very good.
We can really change things quickly if all the people with a head and a heart work together for something good.
Thank you, Congressman Grayson, and I'd like you to come back on again. I'll send out an invitation for you to join me again, okay?
I'd love that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.